The fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical song above the polished linoleum of Sacred Heart's ICU, that particular frequency that only hospital workers learn to ignore after enough shifts. Natalie Hayes moved through the unit at 6:15 in the morning, her shoes whispering against tile still damp from the night janitor's mop, refilling for bags with hands that moved with the kind of practiced precision that came from somewhere deeper than 3 years of nursing school. The antiseptic smell, that sharp bite of bleach and something chemical that never quite left your clothes, hung in the air like a warning nobody heeded anymore. She didn't notice Dr. Richard Ashford watching her from the nursing station. She never did. That was the point. Ashford was the kind of man whose silver hair looked expensive, whose white coat had never been stained with anything messier than coffee, and whose authority over the ICU operated like gravity, constant, invisible, absolute. He stood with his fingers steepled against the desk, tracking Natalie's movements with the detached interest a hunter might give a grazing deer. She moved too smoothly. Most nurses had tells, a slight hesitation before shifting a sedated patient, a wince when adjusting lines in a position that made the back ache. Natalie moved like the body she was handling was a map she'd memorized years ago. Her jaw was set in that permanent neutral expression, the one she wore like a mask, eyes fixed on the cardiac monitor above the bed like it held secrets nobody else could read. A helicopter passed overhead. The sound of rotor blades cut through the hospital's white noise, that deep thump-thump-thump that military transports made, probably heading to the VA complex 12 miles east. Natalie's hand froze mid-reach. Her breath caught. For exactly 3 seconds, no more, no less, her posture shifted, shoulders tensing like a rifle suddenly brought to ready position. Then she inhaled. Slowly. Deliberately. And continued hanging the fresh-for bag as if nothing had happened. But Ashford saw it. He catalogued it. He filed it away in that part of his brain that kept track of leverage. Just a nurse who flinched at helicopters. Probably anxiety. Probably nothing. Except her other hand had moved to her ribs, fingers pressing lightly against her scrubs for just long enough to feel whatever lay beneath. Ashford squinted. Was that scar tissue? He couldn't tell from this distance, but the gesture itself was telling. People didn't absent-mindedly press their hands to old wounds unless those wounds had spent a long time reminding them of their existence. Natalie turned away from the bed and headed back to the medication cart, her face composed again, her breathing normalized. She was already charting the 4 change in the patient's digital file by the time the helicopter sound faded to nothing, swallowed by Portland's morning traffic and the steady beep-beep-beep of 17 monitors tracking 17 fragile human bodies through another day. The call came at 6:42 a.m. Trauma incoming, the charge nurse announced over the hospital comm system, her voice crackling with that particular tone reserved for critical cases. Navy SEAL, Commander Chen, multiple penetrating wounds, 2 units of blood already running, ETA for minutes. Assigning to ICU Bay 3 for post-operative monitoring. Dr. Ashford, patients requested our lead trauma specialist. Ashford's eyebrows rose. Requested. Not assigned by protocol or military chain of command, but specifically requested. Sacred Heart received military referrals regularly enough, the Navy base was close, the trauma program was ranked, and they'd built a reputation for knowing how to keep damaged high-value personnel alive. But requests were unusual. They suggested prior relationship. Connection. Something outside the normal flow of institutional hierarchy. Hayes, Ashford said, not looking at her. You'll be primary on the incoming SEAL. Bay 3. Natalie looked up from her charting. Yes, Doctor. 2 words. That was all she ever gave him, or anyone else. The words themselves were always correct, always professionally calibrated, but they carried the weight of someone who had learned long ago that the less you spoke, the less ammunition you gave people who wanted to use your own voice against you. Her expression didn't change. Her pupils didn't dilate. She simply closed the medication cart and moved toward Bay 3 to prepare the space. But Ashford watched her hands as she moved. Watched how she checked the equipment, ventilator settings, suction apparatus, crash cart positioning, with the kind of methodical precision that suggested she wasn't just thinking about what came next. She was thinking about what came after that, and the decision tree after that, like someone who had once lived in a world where hesitation meant people died. Her fingers moved across the chest tube setup like she was reading Braille in a language only her muscle memory understood. She positioned the defibrillator pads with the exact spacing someone would use if they'd done this hundreds of times, not dozens. The gurney arrived at 6:46 a.m., 6 minutes early. That was always a bad sign. It meant the medics were worried. Commander Chen was conscious, which was the only thing in his favor. Pale as death, breathing through clenched teeth, his Navy-issue t-shirt soaked dark with blood and sweat, but conscious. The trauma surgeon, one of the good ones, someone Ashford actually respected, was bagging him out of the helicopter entrance, already barking vitals at the receiving team. Gunshot wound, left anterior chest, missed the heart by maybe 3 centimeters, we don't know yet, penetrated the left lower lobe, he's lost approximately 2 liters in the field, we've got 2 units running, he's stable for now but I want imaging in the next 30 seconds. They rushed him past the nursing station, the controlled chaos of critical transport, equipment clattering, people moving with that strange synchronization that only happens when everyone in the room understands they're trying to keep someone alive. Bay 3's doors opened. Natalie was waiting. She'd already pulled on fresh gloves, already positioned herself at the head of the bed where she could manage his airway and monitor his consciousness simultaneously. As they transferred Chen from the gurney to the hospital bed, that careful choreography of 1, 2, 3, lift, his eyes swept across the bay and locked directly onto her face. He froze. The paramedics were already stripping away his soaked shirt, already connecting him to Sacred Heart's monitors, already scanning for the next immediate threat to his life. The trauma surgeon was ordering imaging and labs in rapid succession. A respiratory tech was positioning the oxygen mask. Everything was motion, urgency, the contained violence of modern medicine trying to outrun death. But Commander Chen didn't see any of it. His hand, the one that wasn't already sporting an 4-line, reached out as if pulled by something involuntary. His mouth opened. Something crossed his face, recognition, shock, something deeper than simple surprise. Something that looked like seeing someone rise from the dead. Valkyrie? His voice came out hoarse, fractured. How are you? Commander. Natalie's voice was cool, professional, the voice of someone who had trained herself to sound exactly the same when ordering coffee and when telling families their loved ones wouldn't make it past morning. She adjusted his oxygen mask with hands that didn't shake, didn't hesitate, didn't acknowledge the word he'd just spoken. Can you hear me clearly? I need to check your lower abdomen for exit wounds. The rest of the medical team was already doing exactly that, but Natalie had positioned herself directly in his line of sight, and her presence was like an anchor. Like someone pulling him back from somewhere far away. His eyes stayed on her face as the surgeon probed the wound, as the monitors spiked and steadied and spiked again, as X-ray tech moved the portable imaging equipment into position. You're at Sacred Heart Hospital in Portland, Natalie continued, her tone measured. You have a penetrating chest wound. The surgical team is assessing your lower lobe. Your vitals are stable. We're going to keep you that way. She said it like a promise. Like something she wouldn't accept any negotiation on. Dr. Ashford stood just outside the bay, watching through the observation window. He saw Chen's eyes track to her face each time his gaze wandered. He saw the way her shoulders had shifted once, just once, the moment she'd realized it was him. The nearly imperceptible tightening of her jaw when he'd spoken that single word. Valkyrie. Not a name. Not even English, not really. Call sign, maybe. Military designation. Something that meant something to both of them, something that lived in a part of the world that didn't include ICU bays and discharge protocols. His fingers steepled again against the observation window's frame. She knew this man. This commander. This person important enough to request her specifically, which meant he knew her too, knew her before Sacred Heart, knew her from somewhere that had left scars on her ribs and made her flinch at helicopter sounds and required her to have call signs like a weapon. Ashford had spent 18 years building Sacred Heart's ICU into a kingdom where his authority was absolute, where hierarchy flowed downward like gravity and everyone understood their place in the structure. He knew every credential, every certification, every weakness that might be exploited during budget meetings or performance reviews. He maintained that control through meticulous documentation and careful cultivation of alliances with the hospital board, through the simple principle that anyone who could be made small would eventually accept being small. But a nurse with military history. A nurse who understood protocols that existed outside his authority. A nurse who somehow commanded the undivided attention of a high-value military asset. That was a different problem entirely. That was the kind of complication that threatened to unravel everything. He turned and walked back to his office. He had calls to make. Preliminary investigations to consider. The kind of careful, institutional moves that looked like routine administrative procedure but were actually the opening movements of chess played on a much larger board. But that wasn't the worst part. Not yet. The next morning, Dr. Marcus Ashford entered Commander Chen's room at 6:53 a.m. with the casual authority of a man who had never been questioned. Chen's wife Sarah sat in a vinyl chair beside the bed, her hand wrapped around their teenage son David's shoulder. The boy had his father's eyes, dark, alert, still sharp despite the morphine drip running into his arm. Natalie was adjusting the chest tube when she heard Ashford's throat clear, that precise sound of a man announcing his presence before he entered a room he already owned. "Nurse Hayes." His voice carried the tone of someone addressing a subordinate who had disappointed him. "This charting is unacceptable." Natalie's hands didn't pause. She finished securing the tube, checked the drainage chamber, pale yellow, exactly what you wanted to see, and turned to face him with the same expression she'd worn for 3 years at Sacred Heart. Unremarkable. Compliant. Invisible. The vitals documentation, Ashford continued, holding up the chart like evidence at trial. 15-minute intervals. Protocol clearly states 30-minute monitoring for post-operative trauma cases. Sarah Chen leaned forward slightly, anxiety tightening her face. David's jaw clenched. "Commander Chen's condition warranted closer monitoring, Doctor." Natalie's voice was steady, each word measured. She opened the chart, pointing to the vitals line. His O2 sat dipped to 88% at 11:43 p.m. Systolic pressure hit 106. The 15-minute intervals caught the trend before it became critical. She should have stopped there. Protocol was clear, you explained your reasoning once, then deferred to the hierarchy. Natalie knew this. She had lived by this rule for 36 months. But something in Ashford's smile, that thin, predatory curl, told her he wasn't here to discuss medical reasoning. He was here to establish dominance in front of witnesses. "I determine what's warranted, not the help," Ashford said, his voice taking on the sharp edge of a man used to obedience. "This is precisely why we can't trust Nurse Nobody here with complex cases. Your protocols are creative, which is another word for reckless." The silence that followed was the kind you could measure. Sarah's hand tightened on David's shoulder. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm. Outside, rain hammered against the hospital windows like something trying to get in. Commander Chen tried to sit up, pain flickering across his face as the movement pulled at his wounds. "Dr. Ashford, if I could just—" "Commander, please rest." Ashford didn't even glance at his patient. His eye stayed locked on Natalie, waiting for the crack. Waiting for the flinch. "We'll be reassigning your care to someone more experienced. You'll receive far better attention." Natalie took one measured breath. The kind of breath you learn to take when your world is being dismantled in front of people who matter. She let her eyes remain open, steady, locked on Ashford's face. And then a single tear escaped, not a tremor, not a surrender, just one tear that slid down her cheek like evidence of something real. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact. "Commander Chen's care plan remains my priority, regardless of your opinion of my competence." Her voice came out exactly the same as it had been before, a calm, measured, the voice of a professional who had not been shaken. "That hasn't changed." She turned back to the monitor, checked the alarm settings one final time, and walked out of the room with perfect posture, her shoulders squared, her movements precise. The kind of walk that belonged to someone who had learned long ago that falling apart was a luxury she couldn't afford. Behind her, she heard David whisper something to his mother. She didn't turn around. The break room humiliation came 2 days later. Natalie sat at the corner table with a container of Greek yogurt and an apple, her hand steady on the plastic spoon, her eyes fixed on the table in front of her. She had learned not to expect companionship. She had learned to be comfortable with silence. 3 nurses entered together, Patricia from day shift, Rhonda who worked the surgical recovery wing, and Michelle from cardiology. They stopped when they saw Natalie. For exactly 1 second, nobody moved. Then Patricia spoke, loudly enough for everyone in the break room to hear, loudly enough that plausible deniability wouldn't protect her. I need air that's not contaminated by incompetence. Patricia gathered her coffee cup and walked past Natalie's table, brushing her shoulder deliberately. Rhonda and Michelle exchanged a look that had been choreographed by someone else, Ashford, probably, or maybe just the herd instinct of people who could smell weakness. Rhonda leaned down and whispered to Michelle, her voice pitched to carry, "Nurse, nobody strikes again." I heard the Ashford walked her like a dog in the Chen room. They left together, their laughter trailing behind them like exhaust. Natalie ate her yogurt. The spoon made a soft clink against the plastic container. She chewed the apple with deliberate care, each bite exactly the same as the last. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing didn't accelerate. She was a woman sitting alone in a break room eating lunch, nothing more, nothing special, nothing worth noticing. When she finished, she rinsed her container in the sink, dried it carefully, and placed it back in her bag. She checked her watch, 12:36 p.m., and walked back to her unit. She passed 2 other nurses in the hallway. They found sudden reasons to look at their phones. The public write-up appeared on the unit board 3 days later, posted where every staff member passed it during shift changes. The bulletin board where schedule updates and staff announcements lived, where information was supposed to be official and transparent. Natalie saw it when she came in for her evening shift and read it once, her eyes moving across the words with the same focus she applied to medication labels and monitor readings. Incident report, unauthorized protocol deviations, the header read. Below it, in Ashford's precise handwriting, nursing staff member Natalie Hayes has repeatedly documented vital signs at intervals that contradict established hospital protocol for post-operative trauma monitoring. Furthermore, documented instances of insubordinate behavior during patient care rounds have been observed by multiple witnesses. Said behavior creates liability exposure for this institution and undermines physician authority in critical care settings. Recommended action, formal investigation and disciplinary review. Dr. Marcus Ashford, Chief of Emergency Services. The word insubordinate was underlined. Twice. Sarah Chen was waiting in the hallway when Natalie looked up from the board, the woman's face etched with concern and something that looked like doubt. "Miss Hayes, I wanted to, that is, my husband wanted me to tell you," or Sarah's voice caught slightly. "The things Dr. Ashford said about your nursing. Are those things true? We trusted you, but now I'm not sure what." "Commander Chen is receiving excellent care," Natalie said, her voice exactly as professional as always. "That's what matters." Sarah nodded, but her eyes didn't match her expression. She had believed Dr. Ashford. Most people did. Most people trusted the title more than they trusted evidence. That evening, Natalie removed the write-up quietly, folding the paper into precise thirds and placing it in her locker. She didn't crumple it. She didn't let anger dictate the motion. She folded it the same way she would fold a patient's discharge papers, with care, with respect, with the understanding that documentation matters. Within the hour, Ashford had posted a new write-up in its place. This one was addressed to hospital administration. This one was CC to board members. This one included the phrase to potential safety concerns regarding clinical judgment and patient advocacy. When Natalie read it the second time, she noticed something else, a note stapled to the bottom in Ashford's handwriting, follow-up documentation required. See me regarding schedule adjustments. She didn't remove this one. She read it once, memorized every word, and walked away. That night, during her rounds, Commander Chen managed to catch her attention when she was checking his full line. His voice came out in a whisper, urgent and careful, aware of the danger in speaking to her at all. "Major, I need to tell you about," he stopped, struggling with the pain. "About David. About what happened in Kandahar. You need to know." Natalie cut him off with a sharp head shake. "No. Not here. Not now. Not with Ashford prowling the hallways, looking for any excuse to finish what he'd started." She adjusted his morphine drip without speaking, checked his monitors one final time, and walked out of the room. Behind her, she heard Chen exhale, not a sigh, not resignation, but the sound of a soldier understanding an order he didn't want to obey. The shift schedule appeared in her email at 11:14 p.m., timed perfectly so she'd see it before logging off. Effective immediately, Natalie was reassigned from ICU monitoring to post-surgical recovery. Away from Commander Chen. Away from the trauma cases where her expertise actually mattered. Away from anyone who might have seen her competence firsthand. She read the email 3 times, her eyes moving across the words with the same mechanical precision she applied to every clinical decision. Dr. Ashford had signed it. The charge nurse had approved it. There was nothing to fight, nothing to contest. This was how institutional power worked when you had nobody to fight back for you. Then she noticed something else, a note in the schedule comments: "These changes ensure professional boundaries and prevent any appearance of favoritism toward Commander Chen's care. Going forward, all ICU assignments will require Dr. Ashford's prior approval." He had caged her. Efficiently. Completely. The kind of cage you couldn't even see unless you already understood exactly how much you were being threatened. She sat in her car in the parking lot at 11:36 p.m., rain drumming against the windshield in a rhythm like a heartbeat, and reached inside her jacket to touch the faded unit patch sewn into the lining. The patch from Kandahar. The patch that David had stitched there the night before he deployed, whispering that it was her armor, her reminder, her proof that she had survived worse than this. She had survived worse. Much worse. But this slow dismantling, this careful construction of a case to erase her completely, this methodical removal of everyone who might testify to what she actually was, this was different. This was someone who understood institutional power, who knew exactly which levers to pull, who had already decided that her existence was a threat to his authority. Dr. Ashford wasn't just attacking her. He was erasing her. The schedule change wasn't subtle. Natalie saw it posted on the unit board at 6:48 a.m., her name removed from the ICU rotation and reassigned to post-surgical recovery 3 floors down. No notification. No explanation. Just her name erased from where it had been printed for 18 consecutive months and replaced with a junior nurse who'd been at Sacred Heart for 8 weeks. She read it twice, her jaw tightening imperceptibly, then clipped her badge back to her scrubs and headed downstairs. The elevator doors opened on the 3rd floor and released the smell of antiseptic so thick it coated the back of her throat like bleach-flavored water. Post-surgical recovery wasn't demanding work. It was warehousing. Patients who were past crisis but not yet well enough to discharge, spaces where they waited and healed and sometimes complained about the coffee. Natalie moved through the morning with the kind of efficiency that made work vanish, her vitals checked, medications verified, dressing changes completed, documentation precise. By noon, she discharged 2 patients and admitted 3 more, each transition executed with the mechanical precision of someone who had done this so many times that muscle memory required no thought at all. The break room was empty when she entered at 12:15. She poured coffee from the pot that tasted like it had been brewing since 5 a.m., grabbed a yogurt from the communal refrigerator, and sat at the far end of the table with her shift report. She'd been reading for maybe 90 seconds when footsteps approached. 3 nurses, Danielle, Marcus, and Sarah, came through the doorway in conversation, saw her, and the conversation died like someone had cut the audio feed. Danielle glanced at her phone. Marcus checked his watch. Sarah turned immediately back toward the doorway. Actually, we should check on 12, she said. None of them made eye contact. The three of them left as if synchronized, as if they'd rehearsed it. Natalie didn't look up. She turned a page of her report and continued reading. 30 minutes later, she tried again. The break room was occupied, for nurses gathered around a tablet, laughing at something, until she entered. The laughter stopped like a switch. The nurses exchanged glances. One by one, they found reasons to leave, med pass that couldn't wait, phone call they had to make, patient who'd buzzed. Within 60 seconds, she was alone again. By the third occurrence that same shift, she understood the message. This wasn't accident or coincidence. This was orchestration. Ashford had spoken, and the staff had listened, and now she was contagion, the kind of person you didn't sit near, didn't speak with, didn't acknowledge. The cold wasn't overt enough to file a complaint about. It was surgical. It was what isolation looked like when it wore a hospital badge. She was clocking out at 7 p.m. when she noticed the write-up taped to the unit board in the hallway. Her name at the top, typed on official Sacred Heart letterhead, dated that morning. The accusation, improper documentation procedures, specifically failing to countersign pharmaceutical records on 3 separate dates in the past 2 weeks. The signature at the bottom was Dr. James Ashford, chief physician, with a note requesting her immediate acknowledgement and response within 48 hours. Natalie's eyes moved across the page methodically. The dates listed, June 14th, June 19th, June 22nd, were shifts she'd worked. The medications referenced were standard post-op pain management she'd administered thousands of times. The countersigning procedure was hospital protocol that every nurse on her unit performed daily, and every single one of those nurses had occasionally missed a signature in the chaos of patient care. But those nurses weren't under investigation. Those nurses didn't have a Navy SEAL commander asking for them by their call sign. She reached up and tore the write-up from the board. The paper crinkled as she folded it into her pocket. No one was watching. No one cared. The erasure was proceeding exactly as planned. The next morning, she requested a meeting with Ashford. His office was on the 4th floor, corner suite with windows overlooking the city, air that smelled like mahogany furniture and ambient authority. The door was open. Ashford was reviewing something on his computer, his reading glasses perched on his nose, his expression the careful neutral of someone pretending surprise at an interruption he'd been expecting all along. Dr. Ashford, I need to discuss the schedule change. He removed his glasses. The rotation reassignment. Yes. Necessary administrative move. Necessary based on what? Based on optimal patient care allocation. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. Your skill set is better suited to post-op recovery currently. The ICU rotation requires specialists in specific trauma protocols. I've handled trauma protocols here for 3 years. Protocols change. He gestured vaguely toward the window. Patients require consistency in their medical teams. Commander Chen needs continuity with his existing care team. You understand. It wasn't a question. It was statement with the weight of institutional gravity behind it. Natalie's hands remained at her sides, her breathing even, her voice level. I've treated him since admission. Which is precisely why the change was necessary. Ashford stood, moving toward his bookshelf with the slow confidence of someone who had learned long ago that motion created the illusion of being busy. Your emotional investment in a patient is a liability. I'm sure you understand hospital protocol regarding professional distance. Can't have nurses forming attachments, making decisions based on personal connection rather than clinical judgment. The words landed like precise blade strikes. He wasn't wrong about protocol, professional distance was real hospital policy. He was simply weaponizing it, positioning her concern as incompetence rather than dedication. She could feel the trap, object to the rotation, and she was too attached. Accept the rotation, and she was admitting the charge. The documentation write-up, she said. Those countersignatures. I reviewed your records. Ashford returned to his desk, shuffling papers with theatrical slowness. Multiple gaps. Multiple instances of protocol violation. This is documentation now, which gives you opportunity to correct the record and demonstrate understanding of our standards. Those gaps exist in every nurse's documentation on that unit. Perhaps. He looked at her directly for the first time, his eyes behind his glasses like a predator calculating distance. But those nurses haven't had opportunities to demonstrate special competence during patient crises. Those nurses don't have military visitors requesting them by code name. Those nurses are, how shall I say, appropriately professional in their conduct. The implication was crystalline. She was being punished for competence. For the chest seal that had saved Commander Chen's life. For the recognition that came with it. For the intrusion of someone who could see her and acknowledge what she actually was. Ashford adjusted his glasses. "You're dismissed, Major. Excuse me, Nurse Hayes. Do maintain professional boundaries. For everyone's sake." The title had been deliberate, a small cruelty wrapped in near apology. Major was her real rank. Major was what she never used. Major was what nobody here knew. And he'd just reminded her that he was in complete control of the narrative, that he knew exactly which words to use and exactly when to use them. She didn't respond. She turned and left his office, the door closing behind her with pneumatic softness. The reassignment became official by that afternoon. Not just the schedule rotation, a full documentation packet arrived in her mailbox, stamped with the hospital seal and Ashford signature, formally removing her from ICU privileges and restricting her access to floors 4 through 6. The language was hospital protocol language, pending clarification of credentials and professional standards review. It was written in the tone of administrative concern, but it was a prison made of paper. By evening, the shift had changed. The nurses who'd worked with her for 3 years began treating her with the particular coldness that comes from absorbing someone else's narrative. It wasn't overt hostility, they still acknowledged her in hallways, still made minimal conversation, but the quality of attention had shifted. When she asked a question, answers came in clipped sentences. When she offered information, it was met with the smallest of nods. She wasn't a colleague anymore. She was a problem that was being managed. She understood what she was witnessing. This was how institutions protected themselves. This was what happened when you became a liability. The narrative Ashford had built, incompetence, emotional compromise, protocol violations, was settling into the hospital's collective consciousness like sediment in water, darkening everything it touched. By the time she arrived for her shift the next morning, Commander Chen's chart had been updated with discharge planning notes dated 3 days forward. 72 hours. That's what remained before he was transferred somewhere else, to a different medical team, to a place where she couldn't reach him. She had 3 days to find a way back to the ICU, 3 days to hear whatever he needed to tell her about Kandahar, about David, about the last moments before everything stopped. What she didn't know was that Ashford had already made the calls to competing hospitals, already begun arranging the transfer through administrative channels that bypassed medical necessity entirely. The code blue alarm shrieked at 2:02 a.m., that particular pitch that meant ICU, meant critical, meant someone's heart had decided to stop cooperating. Natalie's hand stilled mid-charting in the break room. The overhead speaker crackled. Code blue, ICU Bay 4. Code blue, ICU Bay 4. She didn't move for exactly 2 seconds. Then her body moved without permission from her brain. She was already on her feet, already moving toward the elevators, already knowing, without knowing how she knew, that it was Chen. The badge she'd surrendered 3 days ago hung around her neck by nothing but muscle memory and the desperate arithmetic of hospital security systems that hadn't updated the night shift database in 48 hours. The scanner at the ICU doors chirped. Access granted. The system didn't yet know she'd been fired. The hallway smelled like antiseptic and the particular dread sweat of a patient crashing. She could hear the monitors wailing before she reached the room, that frantic electronic chorus that meant a body was rebelling. When she pushed through the glass doors, she saw everything in the fraction of a second it takes to absorb catastrophe. Chen's oxygen saturation stuck at 71, dropping. His chest tube, the one that was supposed to keep his lung inflated, lay severed on the bed beside him, the line disconnected where it should have been secure. His right lung was collapsing like a building losing its foundation. A second-year resident stood frozen beside the bed, hands shaking, mouth moving without words. "Where's the surgeon?" Natalie's voice came out flat as a runway. 20 minutes. Traffic on the 405. He's en route but... Chen's eyes rolled back. His skin had gone the color of rain-soaked concrete. Oxygen sat at 64. Then 59. Every second that passed was a second his brain wasn't getting what it needed, and in trauma there is no such thing as recovering from lost time. There is only the reckoning. Natalie didn't think. Thinking was for people with options. She moved like muscle memory had been sharpened in Kandahar sand, had been honed in field hospitals where the only equipment you had was the equipment you could improvise and the knowledge that failure meant someone's son never came home. She spotted the MRE package on Chen's bedside table. His wife must have brought it from home, some small comfort from before, some memory of easier deployments. Natalie tore it open. The vacuum-sealed plastic hissed like a living thing. She found the exact size she needed, positioned it over the wound where the tube had torn free, and sealed it down with tape from the crash cart that the terrified resident was finally moving correctly. An improvised chest seal. Field protocol. The O2 stats didn't move. 57, 53. She didn't hesitate. The needle, a 14-gauge angiocath, was in her hand before she consciously decided to reach for it. She found the intercostal space with the certainty of someone whose hands had done this before, had done this under fire with rounds coming through canvas tent walls, had done this because the alternative was leaving someone on a stretcher to die. The needle went between Chen's ribs at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. The anatomical landmarks burned into her memory like scars that wouldn't fade. She felt the resistance give way. Air hissed out, the decompression of a lung trying to escape the chest cavity that should have contained it. O2 climbed. 65, 71. 82. The resident watched like someone watching a ghost perform surgery. But ghosts don't move with that precision. Ghosts don't have hands that steady. Chen's chest expanded. His color began its slow climb back toward living. She left the catheter in place, maintained the seal, and stepped back just as the attending surgeon burst through the doors looking like he'd driven with his foot flat and his faith in traffic laws abandoned somewhere on the freeway. What the hell? Who did this? His eyes locked on Natalie. Recognition flickered first. She'd been on trauma rotation before Ashford buried her in the schedule. Disapproval flickered second, because she wasn't supposed to be here, wasn't cleared to be here, had no institutional authority to touch this patient or these procedures. Patient was deteriorating, Natalie said. On-call ETA was critical. Decompression worked. The surgeon was already assessing, already reading the vital signs with the speed of someone who'd been doing this longer than some people had been alive. He nodded once, sharp and decisive. Good call. Get me a chest tube kit. Full setup. He didn't ask if she should be here. Crisis erases the question marks. She moved, and the resident moved, and the monitors beeped their relief, and Chen's oxygen stayed climbing. By the time the surgeon finished the proper tube placement and sealed the chest the way hospital policy demanded, Natalie had slipped back out of the room. She stood in the supply closet for 3 minutes with her hands braced against the steel shelving, breathing the chemical smell of sterilized equipment, feeling the weight of what she'd done crash down like a building finally surrendering to gravity. Her hands weren't shaking. That came later, came that night when she was alone, came when there was no patient who needed her steady, no crisis that required her composure to hold the shape of a person in control. She clocked out at 6 a.m. as Drive Ashford was clocking in, their bodies passing in the hallway like ships acknowledging each other before deciding to sink. She didn't know yet that the night nurse had reported everything, the code blue, the restriction breach, the unauthorized procedures, the way Natalie had moved through that trauma like someone who'd been trained in ways the hospital's credentialing office had no record of. She didn't know that Ashford was already assembling his evidence like someone building a case designed not just to fire a nurse but to destroy her credentials permanently. By 8 a.m. he'd filed the incident report citing her for practicing outside her scope of practice, for violating her ICU access restriction, for performing procedures she wasn't licensed to perform. He'd called HR. He'd already been calling the other hospitals about the transfer arrangements, already been making it clear that if Sacred Heart wasn't going to discharge Chen, then it would be convenient if something about the hospital's reputation made him want to transfer. By 9 a.m., Natalie was being called into HR, was being handed a suspension letter dated effective immediately, was being told that pending investigation she was not to set foot on the hospital premises. Security would escort her to her car. She'd surrendered her badge at the front desk. The plastic rectangle had felt heavier than any physical object had a right to feel. The woman at the desk, a woman Natalie had nodded to every morning for 3 years, wouldn't meet her eyes. Through the ground floor windows, staff members watched from the corridors like mourners at a funeral for someone who was still alive. 3 days later, it was raining so hard that the cemetery seemed to be drowning. Natalie stood at Marcus's grave with her jacket soaked through to the unit patch sewn inside the lining, the patch from Kandahar, the one David had sewn there before he died, the patch that nobody at Sacred Heart had ever known existed. She whispered into the rain, "I failed them both, Marcus." Her voice sounded like something broken. "I saved the commander, but I couldn't save our boy, and now I can't even hear his last words." The rain came down harder. It sounded like applause for a performance that nobody should have had to give. She didn't hear the engines approach. Didn't hear the convoy pull into the hospital parking lot behind her, didn't know that the next 72 hours would become the hinge upon which her entire life would turn from vertical to horizontal, that the rain would stop and the sky would clear and the truth would arrive wearing military dress uniforms and carrying classified files, and the name she'd been hiding would finally stop being a secret she could keep alone. Dr. Ashford learned of the save by morning, a chest decompression performed by a nurse in the dark with nothing but battlefield instinct, and an MRE package turned into a life-saving seal. Chen's oxygen had climbed from 68 to 89. The commander's lung re-expanded. The patient who should have coded instead stabilized, survived, and would make a full recovery because Natalie Hayes had moved with the muscle memory of someone who'd done this exact procedure under fire in Kandahar 3,000 miles from any operating room. Ashford's face didn't change when the night charge nurse told him. He simply nodded, thanked her, and walked to his office. His hands were steady as he pulled up the incident report template on his computer. Steady as a surgeon's hands when they're about to cut something they want to hurt. He filed the report at 6:24 a.m. Unauthorized practice outside scope of nursing license. Potential patient endangerment. Improvisation without physician oversight. Failure to follow chain of command protocol. Each line was precise, weaponized, devastating. He cited Hospital Policy 4.2.1, advanced interventions require physician authority, and recommended immediate suspension pending investigation. Then he saved it, printed it, and walked it to the administrator's office before the day shift even clocked in. By 7:53 a.m., he was making phone calls. Dr. Harrison on the board, the one who'd supported Ashford's budget increases for 3 years, took the call in his car on the way to his country club. "Her credentials are questionable," Ashford said quietly. "I'm not saying she's fraudulent, I'm simply saying we should verify everything. Hiring records, nursing degree, references. She came in as a lateral transfer with minimal vetting." He paused. "Let that sink in. I'm just being cautious. For the hospital." By the time Harrison hung up, the seed was planted. Questions would follow. Dr. Patricia Huang on the board got her call while she was in a meeting. Ashford's voice was concerned, almost reluctant. "I'm seeing patterns in her charting that worry me. Decisions that suggest she's operating at a level beyond her training. Today she performed an advanced procedure without authorization. I had to report it." He let her draw her own conclusions. She did, and they were the ones he'd planted. The third call went to Marcus Webb, the board's legal liaison. Ashford didn't need to plant much here, just facts arranged like dominoes. I've documented a pattern of insubordination and scope violation. I'm protecting the hospital by documenting it. In case there's litigation. By 8:15 a.m., 3 board members had been infected with doubt. The hospital's legal liability insurance was threatened by a nurse operating outside her credentials. The administrator approved the suspension pending investigation. It was clinical, professional, thoroughly justified. Then Ashford moved to the second phase of his dismantling. He pulled the assignment sheet for the night shift. Every nurse who had been present in the ICU during Chen's crisis was reassigned effective immediately. Sarah Chen, the charge nurse who'd called the code, transferred to the pediatric ward. Marcus Williams, who'd been assisting, suddenly had an opening in orthopedics. The 2 ICU nurses who'd witnessed the entire procedure were split, one to cardiac care, one to the burn unit. By the time most of the hospital's day shift arrived, the entire witness pool had been scattered like seeds in the wind. No witnesses. No one who could testify that they'd seen Commander Chen's collapse, seen his oxygen dropping, seen Natalie's hands move with the precision of someone who'd saved lives before. No one to contradict the narrative that she'd overstepped, improvised recklessly, gotten lucky. Ashford's power came from understanding institutional mechanics the way a surgeon understands anatomy. You don't just cut. You cut in the right places. You sever the connections. You isolate the patient from anything that might help it survive. When Natalie came to him at 10 a.m. on the day of her suspension, her voice was calm and her composure was intact, but there was something behind her eyes that looked like drowning. Commander Chen has information about my son, she said. About David's final moments in Kandahar. I need to speak with him. I'm requesting to remain assigned to his care until he's discharged. Ashford looked up from his desk. His face was a mask of professional sympathy. That's exactly why you can't have access to his care, he said, his voice gentle as a knife sliding between ribs. Your emotional investment in this patient compromises your judgment. Your unauthorized procedure this morning proves it. You're suspended, effective immediately, pending investigation into your credentials and scope of practice. He slid a manila folder across his desk. This is official. HR has already been notified. You'll be escorted from the building. Natalie took the folder. Her jaw tightened, just slightly, just enough for Ashford to see it and feel satisfied that he'd landed a blow. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She simply turned and left his office, and Ashford watched her go with the quiet satisfaction of a man who'd just removed the last obstacle between himself and complete control. She drove to the cemetery in the rain. The cemetery where Marcus Hayes, her husband, killed by an IED in Helmand Province 18 years ago, was buried. The cemetery where their son David, killed at 26 in a different war in the same country, lay in a grave 3 rows away. The rain hammered the ground like distant artillery. Natalie stood between them, the 2 men she'd loved most in the world, and whispered words that the rain swallowed before God could hear them. I saved the commander, she said. But that wasn't enough, was it? It's never been enough. I saved lives in combat and I came home broken. I saved lives here in Portland and I'm being destroyed for it. I failed you both. I failed David when I couldn't bring him home. And now I can't even hear his last words because the man who's supposed to help me is using his death as a weapon. Her voice cracked, only once, only for a moment, and then it steadied again. Forgive me. She stood there until the rain soaked through her coat, until her fingers went numb, until there was nothing left but the sound of water and the weight of 2 headstones and the knowledge that she'd just lost the only person who could tell her what David's last moments had been like. Back at Sacred Heart, Ashford was reaching out to his network one more time. A journalist he knew from a hospital board fundraiser, someone who'd written favorable pieces about the hospital's administration before. The call was careful. Deniable. I'm not going on record, Ashford said. But I'm concerned about a psychiatric profile issue at the facility. There's a staff member who's become emotionally unstable, making concerning decisions. I think you should look into how someone like that reaches a position of responsibility in a trauma department. The journalist took notes. Within 24 hours, he was calling Ashford for comment about hiring practices at Sacred Heart. The article that appeared 3 days later was headlined, "Questions Emerge About Staff Credentialing at Major Portland Hospital." It didn't name Natalie, but everyone would know exactly who it was about. A nurse who'd been suspended for unauthorized procedures. Mental health questions. Scope of practice violations. What the article didn't know, what nobody could have known, was that Ashford was about to commit the mistake that would destroy everything. Natalie's personnel file was stored in the hospital's secure database. Ashford accessed it with his administrator credentials at 2:33 a.m. on the third day of her suspension. He altered her educational records, changed her references, modified the timestamp on her hire. He wanted to build a foundation for a case that she'd misrepresented her qualifications during the hiring process. The altered file would be discovered by HR. There would be legal consequences. Her career would be finished before it could begin. He didn't know that the hospital had implemented new database monitoring protocols 6 months earlier. Monitoring triggered automatically when senior administrators accessed personnel files outside normal business hours. He didn't know that every keystroke was logged. He didn't know that the metadata of his alterations would create a digital trail so clear that federal investigators could follow it with their eyes closed. Official notification arrived at Natalie's house on day 4. She was suspended indefinitely pending investigation into her credentials, her training, her fitness to practice. The letter cited her unauthorized medical interventions, her emotional compromise in the care of a patient, and new questions about her qualifications and training. Ashford had locked away the one person who could tell her about David. And in the process, he'd locked himself into a corner with no exit visible. Natalie sat at her kitchen table and read the letter 3 times, and on the 4th reading, something shifted inside her. Not despair. Not rage. Something quieter and more dangerous. Something that had been sleeping for 18 years, ever since she'd taken off her uniform and put on scrubs and promised herself she would never be that person again. The phone would ring soon. Very soon. A military convoy would arrive at Sacred Heart Hospital. And everything Dr. Richard Ashford had constructed, his authority, his reputation, his control, would come apart in the daylight like paper caught in a current. But he didn't know that yet. He was still sitting in his office, still believing that he'd won, still convinced that the girl in scrubs was just a nurse who'd overstepped and been appropriately contained. If you ever find yourself underestimating the quiet person in the room, the one who keeps her head down, who doesn't fight back, who lets the world think she's weak, maybe ask yourself what she's surviving. Maybe ask what kind of strength it takes to stay silent for 18 years while carrying that kind of weight. Subscribe for the next segment, like this video, and comment, have you ever been completely wrong about someone? The truth is coming, and it's going to shake this hospital to its foundation.